Dawn came slowly to Clear Hollow, Wyoming, a sleepy mountain town still wrapped in the early autumn hush. The fog rolled thick through the valley, a soft silver blanket that clung to rooftops and drifted across the winding dirt roads. Somewhere in that mist, hooves whispered against gravel and dewed earth, steady and synchronized, like a sacred ritual returning to its altar. At the front of the line rode a little girl, slight, silent, and still as breath. She was no taller than the saddle she sat on, but her back was straight, her hands steady on the withers of a chestnut mare named Maple. The mare's stride was calm, measured, ears flicking with quiet focus. Behind them followed 11 Mustangs of every shade and scar, a ghost gray gelding with a crooked blaze, a chocolate-coated mare with storm-colored eyes, a jet-black stallion with a pale scar cutting across his throat like a faded wound from another lifetime. The townspeople had long since stopped asking questions. At first, when the procession began some 18 months prior, there were murmurs, whispers about the little Lane girl and those wild horses. Folks pulled back their curtains before breakfast just to catch sight of her. Some stood on porches with steaming mugs of coffee clutched tight, unsure whether to feel awe or unease. But in time, they came to know the rhythm of her passing. They adjusted their clocks, not to the postman's truck or the school bell, but to the slow parade of hooves and breath that slipped through town like a dream before waking. Harper Lane didn't speak, not with words at least. She hadn't uttered a sound since the accident that took her parents on a rain-slick road 2 years earlier. The wreck was brutal and unspoken of, like a shared wound the town didn't know how to dress. She'd been 5 then, small enough to be lifted out of the crumpled wreckage by the black stallion they would later name Ashwood. At least, that's how the story went. No one could prove it. Not officially. But when Walt Lane, her grandfather, found her curled in the wet grass, scraped but alive, Ashwood stood watch nearby, nostrils flaring and coat steaming with sweat. No one questioned why the horse hadn't run, just as no one could explain how he came to be there in the first place. Walt and Edna Lane had once been the heartbeat of Lane Crest Ranch, a sanctuary for broken Mustangs and bruised hearts tucked into the foothills beyond Clear Hollow. Before age stole their speed and grief stole their son, they'd been revered as whisperers of the wild. Walt could read a horse's gait like scripture. Edna spoke to them with her hands more than her mouth. Their gift wasn't taming exactly, it was listening. That was the way Harper had been raised before everything fell apart. Among hooves and hay, the smell of leather and sweet grain, the slow blink of horses who trusted without words. Now, at 7, she bore the stillness of someone much older. Her dark hair hung in loose braids down her back, tied with frayed ribbon that once belonged to her mother. Her jacket, a faded denim thing 3 sizes too big, had belonged to her father. She wore it like armor. The saddle beneath her had no reins, no bit, just Maple's willing back beneath her and the invisible string of something stronger than training. At the far end of town, just beyond the last bend where the old gas station met the rise of the hills, Sheriff Doyle McCrae sat in his cruiser, engine idling low. His eyes followed the girl and her horses with the kind of gaze that held more weight than it let on. He didn't wave, didn't step out, just watched. He'd seen a lot in Clear Hollow over the years. Bar fights, bear sightings, a decade-old meth lab that burned itself out in a shed behind the grain store. But nothing ever settled in his gut like the girl and her horses. Something about the way they moved, the absolute unity of it, like watching a symphony in motion. He knew what people whispered at the diner counter, that Harper had inherited her parents' strange ability, or that she'd gone feral and the horses were just humoring her. He'd heard it all, and yet He also remembered the crash, remembered pulling up to that smoldering wreck and seeing her cradled in the grass like a ghost too stubborn to leave. What gnawed at him wasn't that she didn't speak. It was that he still didn't know why her parents were out on that stretch of road in the first place, nor why Russell Nash, their neighbor at the time, had lied about being behind them on that stormy night. Doyle had questions, but the only person who might hold answers was a child who hadn't spoken in 2 years. Up at the ranch, the fog lifted slower. Walt had been up since before first light, mending a section of fence Maple had kicked loose the day before. His breath came in shallow gusts as he leaned on the post driver, joints aching, heart heavier. Edna, inside, boiled oats for Harper and hummed an old tune from the days when the house still echoed with the sound of Wyatt Lane's laughter. They didn't expect Harper to say grace anymore. Didn't expect her to finish her breakfast. But she always came home from her ride. Always, without fail, with the same quiet presence, the same light in her eyes that flickered just long enough to say, "I'm still here." Some mornings, Edna swore she saw Harper mouthing words to the horses, soundless prayers or promises she didn't dare speak aloud. Other times, it was enough just to watch them. How Ashwood moved when Harper shifted her weight, how Maple slowed when Harper leaned forward. There were no commands, no ropes, only breath and body and some invisible tether that kept them aligned. The fog thinned as Harper reached the outskirts of town and turned the herd toward the open trail beyond. The sun cut through in long, golden blades, casting the Mustangs in shafts of light that made them look less like creatures and more like phantoms of another world. Sheriff Doyle followed slowly in his cruiser, a cautious distance behind. He wasn't ready to confront anything yet, least of all the questions gathering like storm clouds behind his eyes. Harper, perched on Maple's back, glanced once over her shoulder, not with fear, but with something older than suspicion, a knowing, as if she understood that someone was watching, that someone would eventually come looking not for her, but for the truth buried in the dirt behind her. And as the black stallion turned his head, meeting the sheriff's eyes with a gaze steady and sharp, Doyle knew this wasn't a girl and her horses anymore. It was something else entirely. Something that had been waiting to be uncovered. Something that had never needed words to speak. The wind carried more than dust that morning. It carried questions. They whispered down the alleys of Clear Hollow like rumors dressed in boots, subtle and persistent. Ever since Harper Lane began her silent procession through the town with her 11 Mustangs in tow, folks had tried to place the sight into a category they could make sense of. Some called it a miracle. Others called it madness. But no one dared ignore it anymore. Sheriff Doyle McCrae stood on the wraparound porch of the station house, a mug of bitter coffee cooling in his hands. He wasn't one to journal or ramble, but he had a habit of recording thoughts into a leather-bound notebook. Observations, hunches, small things that didn't sit quite right. Lately, most of those entries had Harper Lane's name at the top. He'd reviewed the old reports again the night before. The Lane accident file, thick with rain-smeared notes and inconsistencies. There was the official version, a head-on collision on a foggy road, faulty brake lines, no clear indication of negligence. But then there were the pieces that had never fit, like the tire tracks that curved off the road away from the tree line, or the dash cam footage that had mysteriously disappeared from Russell Nash's truck. The very man who had once called Wyatt Lane his best friend. Doyle hadn't accused anyone yet, but that didn't mean he'd stopped watching. By mid-morning, he was out again, camera in hand, parked quietly along the dirt trail Harper traveled every day. The fog had lifted just enough for clear shots. Through the lens, he studied the procession. It was uncanny. Harper didn't gesture like someone giving commands. Her movements were minimal, intuitive. A slight lean forward, and the horses adjusted pace. A tilt of her chin, and they realigned, not with precision but with unity. It wasn't dressage. It was something older, like an instinct woven between them. When the girl passed, her eyes met his just briefly. That same knowing from before, like a whisper in a forgotten language. Meanwhile, not far from the edge of town, Clara Halstead sorted through dusty boxes in her attic. She hadn't opened most of them since Eliza Lane's funeral, her old friend, Harper's mother, and the kindest horsewoman Clara had ever known. Eliza had once written that horses didn't need rules, they needed relationship. Clara, long retired from teaching, found herself drawn to memories of the woman she once drank coffee with in the barn at dawn, their laughter rising with the steam from their mugs. At the bottom of a cedar chest, she found them. Eliza's journals, worn leather spines, hand-tied with fraying twine. They smelled of hay and years. Clara flipped through them, scanning scribbled margins filled with notes about each horse at Lane Crest. But it wasn't until she reached the final pages, dated a month before the crash, that her hands trembled. Harper doesn't command them, Eliza had written. She meets them, on a plane I can't reach. Her silence isn't absence, it's communion. Clara set the book down, heart thudding in her chest. It wasn't magic. It was something deeper, something born of pain and presence. She made a call to Verna Crowley, who ran the Morning Brew Cafe. Verna, sharp as a hawk and twice as fast to act, had already started a quiet movement of her own. She'd begun leaving herbal tea out for Harper at the end of the trail, along with crisp apples and small trinkets carved into horse shapes. She'd watch the girl dip her head in a near nod of thanks. That was enough. "I think something's coming," Clara told her. Verna exhaled softly. "It already is." That afternoon, across town, the buzz was growing louder. Linda Groves, the self-proclaimed moral compass of Clear Hollow, had begun gathering names for a petition. Her tone was polite but edged with alarm. "We love Harper, of course," she told anyone who'd listen. "But this, it isn't safe. 11 wild horses following a child through town? That's not grief, that's a liability." Walt and Edna Lane felt the pressure closing in like a tightening rope. They fielded concerned phone calls, saw the stares in the market, the sidelong glances that said more than words ever could. Their granddaughter had become a symbol, but symbols come with scrutiny. Still, Harper never faltered. She rode Maple with the poise of someone who knew she belonged nowhere else but right there, surrounded by the creatures who somehow understood her. Then came the unexpected knock. Dr. Elliot Marsh. Soft-voiced, wire-rimmed glasses. Boots muddy from the pastures he'd already visited. A behavioral therapist specializing in equine-assisted therapy, sent quietly by someone in the county who hadn't signed Linda's petition, but hadn't ignored it either. He didn't ask Harper to speak. He didn't ask anything, really. He watched, and what he saw stirred something old in him. Ashwood, the black stallion with the scarred throat, never left Harper's side. He followed her as if tethered by heartstrings. When she stopped, he stopped. When she touched her chest, he lowered his head. And once, when Harper raised her hand ever so slightly, the entire herd fanned into a semicircle around her, as if they knew where to be before the question was even asked. "This isn't training," Dr. Marsh murmured to Walt later that evening. "It's trust, rare as rain in the high desert, and twice as vital." But even trust can tremble beneath the weight of secrets. Across the ridge, inside an old hunting cabin near the forest line, Russell Nash sat hunched over a glass of cheap whiskey, watching the flickering news coverage of Harper's procession on his battered TV. The girl was gaining attention. Too much attention. Her face on the screen, her silence described in reverent tones, the mystery of the Mustangs glorified like folklore. He gripped the glass tighter. He remembered the night of the crash too well. Remembered the curve, the headlights, the gut-hollowing realization that he wasn't supposed to be there at all. And he'd never forgotten the look on Ashwood's face through the windshield, like the horse knew him, like it judged him. He'd told the sheriff a version of the truth, but not the truth that mattered. Later that night, as rain fell soft and cold, Walt found Harper's room empty. Her boots were gone. Her coat, too. And Ashwood's stall door swung gently in the wind. On her pillow, folded like a secret, lay a scrap of paper torn from her notebook. 6 words, scrawled in small, steady hand. He needs me. I have to go. Walt called Edna. She called Doyle. Doyle called Clara. And the town, still half asleep beneath the weight of its doubts, had no idea that the quiet girl who spoke with no voice had just stepped into the night, chasing answers that only the past could give. The morning after Harper vanished into the fog with Ashwood, the town of Clear Hollow awoke with a chill in the air, and something colder still gripping its heart. The news spread faster than the frost climbing up the windows. A 7-year-old girl, mute since the night her parents died, had ridden off into the wilderness with an untamed stallion and left only a note behind. By noon, the phone at Lane Crest rang off the hook. Sheriff Doyle paced the porch, jaw tight, listening to a chorus of worried townspeople asking how a child could slip through the cracks. Edna sat curled in a rocking chair, holding the note like it might vanish if she loosened her grip. Walt stood by the barn gate, watching the trail disappear into the distant trees, his eyes narrowing every time a shadow moved among the pine needles. No one knew where Harper had gone, but everyone had an opinion about why and who to blame. Linda Groves wasted no time. By that evening, her kitchen was filled with folding chairs, handouts, and freshly printed flyers reading, "Protect our children, not the horses." She stood at the head of the table, a pointer stick in one hand, an iPad in the other, displaying blurry photos of Ashwood mid-gallop, mane wild like storm clouds. She could have been hurt, Linda declared, sweeping her gaze across the room of nodding heads. She could be hurt now. And let's be honest, what kind of oversight are we trusting here? 2 elderly folks with bad knees and no fencing. 11 wild horses and no reins in sight? This isn't therapy, it's negligence with a sugar coating. The murmurs rose, and Linda seized her moment. We owe it to Harper to step in, before this ends in tragedy. The petition had over 100 signatures by sundown. Back at Lane Crest, the silence was heavy. Walt leaned on the fence, staring at the empty corral, Ashwood's absence like a wound. Edna busied herself in the kitchen, hands moving through the motions of making soup she knew Harper wouldn't eat tonight. The sheriff returned before dark, mud on his boots and uncertainty in his eyes. He'd found tracks near Silver Hollow Creek, hoof prints and small boot marks, but the rain had smeared the trail. He was calling in a few search volunteers, but he didn't want to escalate it yet. "She's not running," he told Walt quietly. "She's looking for something. I just hope she finds it before something finds her." While worry gathered like storm clouds in Clear Hollow, a different kind of wind blew in. Maggie Rhodes arrived in town with a battered Jeep, a camera bag slung over her shoulder, and a journalist's instinct for where stories ran deeper than headlines. Her editor had flagged a viral video, a silent girl leading a procession of Mustangs down a country road. That clip had been enough to earn a feature assignment. But when she learned the girl had disappeared, Maggie knew she was no longer chasing a story. She was chasing a heartbeat. She stopped first at Verna Crowley's cafe, ordered a black coffee, and listened. "It's not what folks are saying," Verna told her, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "That girl isn't broken. She's just speaking a language most of us forgot." Maggie drove out to Lane Crest that afternoon. She found Edna by the porch, arms crossed, a brave face stretched over an ocean of grief. Walt sat beside her, offering few words, but when Maggie asked if she could see the stables, he nodded once and led her through. The corral was empty, but the stillness hummed with memory. Maggie looked at the worn gate, the water trough, the scatter of hoofprints in the soft earth. She imagined Harper moving through this space like a shadow of her mother, guiding horses without voice, only with breath and trust. She turned her camera on, capturing the ghost of something sacred. That night, Dr. Elliot Marsh reviewed his notes from the last visit. He had returned to Clear Hollow when he heard the news, driven more by instinct than protocol. The data he'd gathered on Harper's interactions with the Mustangs, especially Ashwood, was extraordinary. Her gestures, her posture, her breath, they didn't mimic training techniques, they transcended them. "This is not a case of control," he recorded into his voice memo. "This is co-regulation. She calms them, and they calm her. It's symbiotic, and it's rare." When Sheriff Doyle called and told him they'd found Harper's trail heading toward the bend where the accident had happened 2 years ago, Dr. Marsh closed his notebook and stood. He knew what she was looking for, but someone else was looking too. Clara Halstead had been quiet for days, poring through Eliza Lane's journals and connecting dots. And then she made a bold move. She showed up at the mechanic shop where Russell Nash still worked the back bay. She didn't wait for permission. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked him. "The night of the crash." Russell froze with a wrench in his hand. Clara stepped closer, her voice low but unwavering. "You were there, right behind them. The camera footage disappeared, and now Harper's gone chasing ghosts into the woods because no one ever told her the truth." Russell's face drained of color. His hand shook. I didn't think the horse would be there," he muttered. "I saw it pull her out of the car. I swear I did." Clara didn't flinch. "Then it's time you told someone." But before she could press him further, her phone buzzed. A text from Doyle, short and sharp. They found them. The rain came hard that night, hammering the tin roof of the station house and pelting the fields beyond Lane Crest. The search team returned soaked and breathless, but not empty-handed. They hadn't found Harper yet, but they'd found a clue. A rusted hair clip tucked into the bark of a pine near Silver Hollow. A child's handwriting on a damp slip of paper pinned beneath it, clinging to the tree like a prayer. Ashwood remembers. So do I. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving behind a silver mist that hung low over Clear Hollow's ridgelines. Rain still dripped from pine boughs, and the earth along the western trail glistened with fresh mud and memory. Out past the last fence line of Lane Crest, in the unclaimed stretch where wild things still held sway, Harper Lane rode in silence, just as she had every morning. But this time there was no procession, no audience, no town to mark her passing. Only Ashwood ran with her now, the great black stallion's breath pluming like smoke in the chilled air, his pace steady, hooves thudding against soaked earth in rhythm with her pulse. 11 horses had once followed, but this journey wasn't for them. This was for something deeper, older. She led him west. Through wind-worn gullies and narrow game trails only the deer dared follow. Through mossy switchbacks and creeks swollen by last night's storm. And as the sun began to stretch through the low clouds, she came upon it. the bend in the road near Silver Hollow Creek, the place where it had all changed. The wreckage was long gone. Nature had reclaimed what man's tragedy had torn open. But Harper saw it all clearly, the way the truck had come from the left, the flash of her mother's scream, the way her father's arm flung protectively across her chest, the silence after, the fire, and then Ashwood appearing through the haze like something summoned. She slid off his back, her boots sinking slightly into the mossy ground. The air smelled of cedar and old secrets. She stepped forward slowly, scanning the creek bank. At first, there was nothing but the rush of water and the whisper of wind. Then she saw it. Half buried under the wet leaves, just above the waterline, was a glint of silver. Her breath caught. She dropped to her knees and brushed it free with trembling fingers. A bracelet, bent and scorched, but unmistakable, her mother's. Her throat tightened, her vision blurred. Behind her, Ashwood stepped forward, snorting gently. He nosed the ground just ahead of her, pushing aside the brush. Harper's eyes widened. There, pressed into the soft mud, was a deep, old groove, the kind a body makes when it's dragged. And alongside it, a single hoof print. Ashwood's. Her lips parted. No words came, none were needed. She knew now. The pieces fell into place. She hadn't escaped the wreck on her own. Ashwood had pulled her out, carried her to safety while the fire consumed everything else. She stood slowly, her small hand pressing to the stallion's damp flank. He didn't move, just stared at her, steady as a mountain. Her fingers curled into his coarse mane. Then a twig snapped. She turned. Russell Nash stepped out from the trees, soaked to the bone, face pale, eyes wide with something that hovered between guilt and fear. His clothes clung to him like old regret. I thought no one would ever come back here," he said, voice rough as gravel. Harper didn't flinch. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, hands trembling. "I saw the light go red, but I thought I could beat it. I was late for a job. I wasn't drunk, I swear I wasn't. But I was distracted. On the phone. I didn't see them until it was too late." Ashwood took a step forward, and Russell instinctively backed up. "I saw the horse pull you out," he said, swallowing hard. "I was standing right over there." He pointed across the creek to a line of trees. "I should have helped. I should have done something." Harper's fists clenched. "I panicked," he said. "I ran. I didn't even call 911. I just left. By the time I came back, the firefighters were already there. They asked questions. I lied, said I wasn't in the area." Harper stared at him, her face unreadable. The stallion shifted closer to her, placing himself squarely between the man and the child. Russell looked down. "I've carried that night every day since," he whispered. "I see your parents' faces in my dreams. I hear the tires." The glass Ashwood let out a low, guttural sound, not a whinny, something more primal, a warning. Russell staggered back, slipping in the wet grass. Harper stepped forward then, not to confront, but to pick something up from the ground. A small, water-warped camcorder half hidden near a tree root, covered in moss and thyme. She wiped it gently with her sleeve. The initials WL were etched into the side, her father's. Her breath hitched. She looked to Ashwood. He nodded, just once, like he knew. From behind the trees, voices rang out. "Harper!" It was Sheriff Doyle, crashing through the undergrowth with Clara Halstead, doctor. Marsh and Maggie close behind. The sheriff spotted the girl first, relief washing across his face. "You had us worried sick, kid," he said, then slowed when he saw Russell. Clara's gaze flicked between them, then down to the bracelet in Harper's hand. "What's going on here?" Doyle asked, more carefully now. Harper stepped forward, raised her notebook, and slowly tore out a page. She handed it to Maggie. The reporter read it aloud. He saw it. He ran. But I remember. Ashwood remembers too. Russell closed his eyes. Maggie looked at Harper, then turned her camera on, not to exploit, but to witness. The girl said nothing, but in that silence, standing between the creek and the trees, with the bracelet in one hand and the stallion at her side, she told a whole story of loss, of loyalty, of truth. As they began the long walk back toward town, Harper climbed onto Ashwood's back. Clara squeezed her hand gently as they passed. Doyle followed with a storm in his jaw. And somewhere, just beyond the mist, the truth had finally found its voice. The courthouse in Clear Hollow had never seen so many people packed into its narrow pews and wooden benches. On ordinary days, it settled land disputes, issued dog licenses, or handled minor noise complaints. But this morning, a hushed storm of tension brewed beneath the high windows as townsfolk gathered elbow to elbow, waiting to see if a little girl would be stripped of the only anchors she had left in this world, her Mustangs. Outside, the first frost of the season glittered on the courthouse lawn, the air crisp with approaching winter. Inside, the weight of a dozen glances pressed heavily on Harper Lane, who sat between her grandparents, Edna and Walt, in the front row. Her notebook rested in her lap, spine worn soft from handling, corners frayed like a memory. She didn't look around the room. She didn't need to. They were all there. Sheriff Doyle, leaning against the back wall with arms crossed and jaw set. Clara Halstead, with her worn leather purse and a stack of old journals from Harper's mother. Maggie Rhodes, with a pen poised over her notepad. Dr. Elliot Marsh, posture straight, eyes watchful, a file folder gripped in both hands. And Linda Groves, composed, lips pursed, standing beside her lawyer like a sentinel of civic righteousness. The judge, a stern woman named Judith Callan, rapped her gavel once. "This hearing is now in session," she announced. "We are here to assess the safety and welfare of Harper Lane and determine whether continued contact with the wild horses at Lane Crest poses a public or personal danger." Linda's attorney stood first, adjusting his glasses with a dramatic pause. "We are not here to question this child's trauma," he began, his voice smooth, "nor to vilify the horses themselves, but the facts remain. A 7-year-old child with selective mutism, still processing significant grief, is being permitted to ride and manage 11 untamed Mustangs, daily, unsupervised." He gestured toward the gallery. "This has become a spectacle, a child turned into a symbol. But symbols don't ensure safety. The risk is real. The public concern is justified." He clicked a remote. A projector displayed still images across the room. Photos of Ashwood mid-gallop, hooves in the air, the horses flanking Harper like a military unit, a blurred moment from the day Mary Beth Holloway fell. "These animals may be well-meaning," he said, "but they are still animals, and this girl is still just a child." A low murmur rumbled through the courtroom. Then Dr. Marsh stepped forward. With no slideshow, no theatrics, he simply opened his folder and laid a short stack of clinical notes on the table. "I've worked with equine therapy for nearly 2 decades, he said. "I've never seen anything like what exists between Harper and these horses." He glanced briefly at the judge, then back to the audience. "She doesn't just command them. She partners with them. Her cues are nonverbal, intuitive, and entirely effective. I observed Ashwood respond to Harper's breathing, to the tilt of her shoulder, even to the subtlest change in her posture. This is not standard training. It's a bond built on mutual trust." He paused. "And I believe that separating Harper from these horses would not only be unjust, it could severely damage the progress she's made in overcoming trauma." Next, Maggie stepped up. She held out a printed article titled "The Girl Who Spoke with Hooves" and placed it in front of the judge. "This story has now been read by over 1 million people," she said, "not for the novelty of a child riding wild horses, but because it touches something deeper. A community watched this girl suffer, then heal, not with words but with presence. And the horses? They didn't just follow her, they listened, they waited, they protected her." The courtroom was silent as Judge Callan adjusted her glasses. "And does the child wish to speak for herself?" she asked. Harper didn't move at first. Then, without prompting, she rose to her feet, her notebook clutched tightly in her small hands. Her boots tapped softly against the wood floor as she approached the bench. The bailiff stepped forward to assist, but she shook her head gently. Then she climbed the short steps to stand directly before the judge. She opened her notebook. 1 page, written in deliberate, uneven letters. "Ashwood saved me when no one else did. Please don't take him away." She stood there, unmoving, holding the page as though it was the last bridge left between her and the world. The judge took the note and read it again in silence. And then, something happened that no one in Clear Hollow had heard in 2 years. A voice, quiet, ragged. "Harper." "They're my voice," she whispered, barely louder than breath. "They say the things I can't." No one in the room moved, not a cough, not a shuffle, just breathless awe. Edna Lane let out a soft sob. Walt gripped the edge of his seat so tightly his knuckles went white. Doyle's eyes brimmed with something he didn't let fall. Even Linda Groves sat stunned. Judge Callan exhaled slowly. "In light of the testimony, the expert evaluations, and the evidence presented," she said, voice steady, "this court finds that Harper Lane shall remain in the custody of her grandparents, Walt and Edna Lane, and shall be permitted continued supervised contact with the horses of Lane Crest Ranch." A collective breath rose across the courtroom. "Furthermore," the judge added, "Ashwood will be designated as a certified emotional support animal, pending veterinary and behavioral documentation. Monthly welfare checks will be instituted, and professional therapy will continue under Dr. Marsh's supervision." She looked at Harper with softened eyes. "This court is not blind to the pain you've endured, or to the strength you've shown. Sometimes healing speaks in silence." The gavel came down. One sharp, final sound. The crowd erupted, not with noise, but with motion. Neighbors offering quiet nods, hands clutched to hearts, Clara reaching for Harper's hand. Linda left without a word. Outside, as the sun burned through the morning mist, Harper mounted Maple in the gravel lot beside the courthouse. Ashwood stepped forward beside her, head high, mane wild in the breeze. Behind them, 11 Mustangs emerged from the fog. Released from the trailer Walt had quietly brought down from the ranch. A girl, her horses, moving forward together. And on a hill just beyond the town limits, the townspeople watched in reverent silence as hooves beat soft and sure against the earth. A new rhythm, a new beginning. And Harper Lane, no longer silent, only still.